On the morning of July 4th, 2026, an 18-year-old named Nolan Xavier Wells got on a boat with a group of friends and headed out into the Gulf of Mexico. He would never come home. What happened on that island in the hours that followed remains, as of this recording, an open question. There is no verdict here. There is no confession. There is no single witness who has stepped forward to explain, once and for all, what happened to Nolan Wells. What there is, instead, is a fragmented and painstakingly reconstructed timeline, built from GPS records, drone flight logs, Coast Guard radio traffic, Marine Patrol reports, a fragment of video captured on Snapchat, and the conflicting memories of teenagers who were there and have never fully agreed with one another. This is not a story with a tidy ending. It is a story still being written in real time by investigators, by a grand jury that has not yet convened, and by a family that is still waiting for someone to tell them the truth. Before we get to Nolan, it helps to understand the place he disappeared from, because Horn Island is not an ordinary beach, and the conditions that shape this case are inseparable from the geography of the island itself. Horn Island is a long, narrow barrier island sitting in the Gulf of Mexico, roughly 10 to 12 miles south of Ocean Springs, Mississippi, part of a chain known as the Mississippi-Alabama Barrier Islands. It stretches for several miles, but is less than a mile wide at its widest point, a thin ribbon of sand, dune, and pine that separates the open Gulf to the south from the calmer waters of the Mississippi Sound to the north. The island has a long and layered history. It was used by the U.S. Army for classified testing during the Second World War, when it was closed off entirely to the public. It became a federally managed wildlife refuge in the 1960s, was folded into the newly created Gulf Islands National Seashore in 1971, and in 1978, Congress designated it a protected wilderness area, one of the last truly undeveloped barrier islands left on the Gulf Coast. It has weathered hurricanes, including Katrina in 2005, which swamped the island almost entirely, and it sits close enough to the site of the 2011 Deepwater Horizon oil spill that its shores were once encircled by tar and oil. Today, it is managed by the National Park Service, home to more than 200 documented bird species, sea turtles, and shifting freshwater ponds tucked between the dunes. There are no bridges to Horn Island and no ferry service. The only way to reach it is by private boat. And critically, once you are there, according to the National Park Service, there is no ranger stationed nearby, no drinking water, no shelter, no restroom facilities, and no cell phone signal. It is a place of real, wild beauty, and it is also a place where if something goes wrong, help is not close at hand. On the 4th of July, that isolation does not stop people from coming. Investigators would later estimate that roughly 300 people converged on Horn Island that day, many of them, like Nolan and his friends, former high school classmates, using the holiday as an excuse to gather on the water, the way they apparently had more than once before. Nolan Wells grew up in the Ocean Springs area of Mississippi. Those who knew him describe a young man who stood out in more ways than one. He was remembered by friends and family as a standout football player, 6'1" and around 180 pounds, tall enough to tower over most of the people around him in photographs, with what several people who knew him called an infectious smile. He had just finished high school and was expected to return to school later that summer to begin training for the upcoming football season. His parents, Christine Wansley and Elmore Wansley, would later describe him publicly as a special soul, a description offered by his mother in the raw and painful days after his body was found. In the photographs his family has shared since his death, Nolan is almost always surrounded by other people, an arm slung casually around a friend's shoulders, smiling at the camera. Friends described the group he ran with as tight-knit, a circle that had known each other since high school, racially and ethnically diverse, the kind of friend group that had made this same trip to the island together before. Records obtained from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources allow investigators, and now us, to reconstruct the boat's movements almost to the minute. The vessel Nolan was on departed from the southern shore of Mississippi at 9:56 in the morning. It arrived at the western tip of Horn Island at 11:14 a.m. Nolan's best friend, a young man named Javen Williams, had planned to ride out to the island on the same boat, but there wasn't room, so he traveled separately on a different vessel. Javon has said that he saw Nolan as soon as he arrived on the island, and the group spent the day the way you would expect a group of 18 and 19-year-olds to spend a holiday on a remote sandbar in the middle of the Gulf, swimming, drinking, talking, drifting in and out of each other's company across a crowded beach that day was hosting hundreds of strangers and friends alike, many of them arriving by boat. Many of them, according to later accounts from search and rescue volunteers, drinking throughout the afternoon. According to reporting from WLOX and other outlets that have pieced together witness statements, the last time several of Nolan's friends say they physically saw him on the island was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the northwest end of Horn Island. He was wearing blue swim trunks, no shirt, and sunglasses. The group was beginning to gather itself to head back to the mainland. And this is where the story, which up to this point has been relatively straightforward, begins to fracture into two different accounts that do not agree with each other. One version comes from a young woman named Katie McCormick, who was 19 years old at the time and was on the island that day with a different group of friends. According to her account, relayed publicly through her sister Gracie McCormick, because Katie herself has not given interviews, Nolan told her that he intended to get on the boat back home with his own friends. In this version of events, Katie had a conversation with Nolan, assumed he was heading toward his group to leave with them, and thought nothing more of it. Her sister has said that Katie and Nolan spoke only briefly, that Katie later left the island separately with her brother and his fiancée, and that the McCormick family has fully cooperated with investigators and with Wells's family throughout the process. The other version comes from Nolan's own friends, the group he arrived with. According to a Marine Patrol report from the Department of Marine Resources, several of those friends told deputies that when they left the island, Nolan was in the company of a woman they did not know, and that he had chosen to remain behind. In this account, Nolan told them he intended to stay on the island longer, and his friends left under the belief that he had made that choice himself, trusting that he would find his own way back or catch a ride with someone else later. These two accounts cannot both be true in the way they've been described, and Nolan's family, along with their attorney, civil rights lawyer Ben Crump, has emphasized this contradiction directly. Somebody, in Crump's words, must not be telling the truth. It is one of the central, unresolved tensions of this entire case. A group of witnesses who were all on the same small stretch of sand that afternoon, and who cannot agree on the most basic fact of what happened before the boat left without Nolan on it. Adding to the confusion is a piece of video that surfaced from that day, recorded on Snapchat by someone who was on the island. The video appears to capture an argument taking place, a heated exchange between at least two people. Investigators and reporters examining the footage have identified a voice in the recording, reportedly Nolan's, demanding that someone return his phone to him. The video is brief, the audio is not entirely clear, and its full context, who was involved, what prompted the argument, and how it ended, has not been established through any public verified account. A later report claimed that enhanced audio pulled additional detail from that same clip, but an outside audio expert publicly disputed the reliability of that enhancement, meaning the video, for now, remains exactly what it originally was. A few seconds of raised voices on a beach crowded with hundreds of people, one piece of a much larger puzzle investigators are still assembling. What is not in dispute, because it comes from hard GPS data rather than memory, is what happened to the boat itself. According to records from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the vessel left Horn Island at 4:31 in the afternoon and began making its way back toward the mainland. It returned to its original departure dock, then later traveled into an area called Fort Bayou at 5:52 p.m., before returning to the dock again at 6:06 p.m. At no point in this sequence of movements does Nolan Wells appear to have been aboard. The friends who left the island that afternoon did so without him. For several hours after the boat's return, there does not appear to have been alarm. It was, after all, a holiday, a day when friend groups scatter and regroup, when someone staying behind on an island full of people they know might not, in the moment, seem like cause for concern. That changed as the evening went on. Christine Wonsley called a company called Cito, then contacted the Jackson County Sheriff's Office directly. Records show that around 4:30 that afternoon, before the boat had even fully returned, a Department of Marine Resources officer had already reached out to her, and she told him her son had spoken with the sheriff's office earlier in the day, but that she would cooperate however was needed. What followed, according to Woonsley, was a period of what she described as back-and-forth confusion between different agencies, complicated by the fact that Horn Island sits out in the Mississippi Sound, a jurisdictional gray area between multiple departments. Eventually, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office opened a formal report. Later that night, Nolan's parents met a deputy in a McDonald's parking lot to relay everything they knew. That same night, according to the family, a friend of Woonsley's went to retrieve Nolan's phone from the home of one of his friends, and Elmore Woonsley went to a different friend's house to collect Nolan's car keys and car. The parents have said they encountered difficulty getting those items back, though the full explanation for that difficulty has not been made public. The formal search machinery began moving the next morning. Coast Guard Sector Mobile received a request for assistance from the Jackson County Sheriff's Office shortly after noon on July 5th and issued an urgent marine information broadcast, sending a helicopter to search the waters around Horn Island. Around the same time, the Sheriff's Office issued a public press release describing Nolan Xavier Wells as an 18-year-old black male, approximately 6'1" and 180 pounds, last seen on the island wearing blue swim trunks, no shirt, and sunglasses. That evening, in an email to Coast Guard authorities requesting search and rescue data, a Department of Marine Resources official relayed that physical description and noted, according to documents later obtained by reporters, that Wells's alcohol intake that day had been heavy. The official search effort was not the only one underway. As Christine Woonsley posted increasingly urgent appeals for help on social media, volunteer groups began mobilizing on their own. The United Cajun Navy, a nonprofit search and rescue organization based in Louisiana, sent people and equipment to help. Its coordinator on the ground, Josh Gill, dispatched a search and rescue operator and an off-duty police officer out to the island with a drone. When Gill contacted the Coast Guard directly, he was told that the Jackson County Sheriff's Office was taking the lead on the investigation. Several of Nolan's own friends took boats out on their own to search the island themselves and told reporters they observed a helicopter overhead, boats from the Biloxi Fire Department, and Department of Marine Resources personnel also working the area. A private pilot, a man who had helped search these same waters once before, in 2024, for a 7-year-old who drowned in a boating accident, took his propeller plane up just after 6 o'clock in the morning to help look for Nolan. He had a personal connection to the case. His own teenage son was part of Nolan's circle of friends, though the son had been out of town that 4th of July. For him, by his own account, this search felt different, more personal than the volunteer flying he normally did. The official aerial search faced its own obstacles. According to police documents, Department of Marine Resources officials attempted 3 separate drone launches to survey the western side of Horn Island on July 5th. The first flight, which began around 10 in the morning, was cut short by a software malfunction that could not be repaired in the field. Around 10:30, 2 additional drones were requested and launched. One of those later flights ended abruptly when a swollen battery, a result of excessive heat, separated from the drone mid-flight. According to the official report, further flight attempts were canceled altogether because of the extreme heat conditions that day, and the drone effort ultimately failed to locate Nolan. One of Nolan's high school friends, a young man named Triseston Shepard, had been on Horn Island that day and stayed in the search effort as it unfolded. He later said that he and his friends had spent that first anxious night holding on to a hopeful, mundane explanation that Nolan had simply fallen asleep on someone's couch somewhere and hadn't woken up yet to check his phone. That hope did not survive long. Writing to her growing online audience on July 6th, before her son's body was found, Christine Woonsley described a family with, in her words, so many questions, hearts breaking, still waiting for Nolan to walk through the door with his beautiful smile. And, she added, a joke of course. Sheriff John Ledbetter, addressing the case publicly in those early days, offered the Jackson County Sheriff's Office's working understanding of what had happened based on witness interviews up to that point. From what his department had been told, he said, it sounded like Nolan had chosen to stay on the island under the assumption that he would ride back to the mainland with someone else. It was an early tentative account based on the same conflicting witness statements that would go on to become a central point of dispute in the case, and it was directly at odds with what Nolan's parents believed. Elmore and Christine have both said publicly that they cannot fathom their son choosing, on his own, to separate from his group of friends on a remote island. We always taught him, his father has said, that if you go with a group, you stay with the group. On the morning of Monday, July 6th, at approximately 8:45 a.m., law enforcement found a body in the water just off Horn Island, on the island's north shore, near its western tip, not far from where Nolan had reportedly last been seen 2 days earlier. The following day, the Jackson County Coroner's Office, through Coroner Bruce Lind, confirmed through dental records that the body was Nolan Wells. Brian Trasher, the vice president of the United Cajun Navy, had helped search for Nolan from the air before the body was found, and he later offered his own account, carefully framed as the observation of a search and rescue volunteer rather than a formal investigator. He described the beach on July 4th as packed with boats and people, many of whom had been drinking, and he said that if someone had gone into the water that day, strong rip currents in the area could have posed a real danger. A separate pilot who had helped search by air said something similar after the body was recovered. Based on where Nolan was ultimately found, he believed a rip current may have initially carried him away from shore before a shift in the tide brought him back, which would help explain why the body surfaced so close to where Nolan was last seen alive. Both men were careful to describe this as an informed theory, not a conclusion, and Nolan's own family has pushed back against the drowning explanation altogether, telling reporters that their son was a strong swimmer and that they remain unconvinced the water alone explains what happened to him. The days that followed the discovery of Nolan's body were marked by public grief and almost immediately, public scrutiny. On the same day that Nolan's identity was confirmed, attorney Ben Crump announced that he had been retained to represent the family, stating in a public release that they were calling for what he described as a thorough and transparent investigation. Crump's involvement and the family's public statements in the days that followed quickly elevated a local tragedy into a story of national attention. Nolan was laid to rest in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, with the Reverend Al Sharpton officiating the funeral, another marker of just how far this case had traveled from a private family tragedy into a matter of sustained public interest. Part of what fueled that attention was the racial dimension of the case. Nolan Wells was black. Photographs from the boat trip that surfaced publicly showed him spending the day primarily among a group of friends who were white. As those images circulated on social media, they became, in the words of one national outlet, something of a Rorschach test for American race relations, a focal point for speculation, questions, and in some corners of the internet, outright accusation about whether race played a role in what happened to Nolan, and about whether the investigation into his death was being conducted with the same urgency and rigor it would receive under different circumstances. Sports commentator Stephen A. Smith raised the case publicly during an interview on News Nation, arguing that any parent who sends a child out for the day expects that child to come home, and describing what he characterized as suspicion within the black community about how the case was being handled. It is worth being precise here. Authorities have not at any point in the public record identified a suspect or indicated that Nolan's death was the result of foul play. What has been documented is that his death occurred under circumstances his own parents find difficult to accept as accidental, and that the racial optics of the case have shaped much of the public conversation around it, independent of what the physical evidence does or does not show. That belief that Nolan did not choose his own fate that afternoon is one of the driving forces behind the independent investigation the family has since launched, separate from the official state investigation being conducted by Jackson County authorities and the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. Attorney Eric Hertz has been identified as the lead figure on the family's independent legal team. According to statements from Crump and Hertz, that team has been working alongside what they describe as oceanic engineering experts, examining questions about currents, tides, and drift patterns in the water around Horn Island, specifically trying to understand how and why Nolan's body was ultimately found in nearly the same location where he was last known to have been on the island 2 days earlier. It is a detail the family's team has flagged as scientifically significant. A question about whether ocean currents in that area would be expected to carry a body back toward its starting point, or whether that outcome raises questions that deserve closer examination. The question of cause and manner of death has itself become one of the most contested elements of this case, largely because more than 3 weeks after Nolan's body was recovered, the public still does not have a definitive answer. Frustrated by what they described as contradictions in early information from investigators and concerned about a lack of transparency, the Wells family commissioned their own independent autopsy. The results of that private examination were announced publicly on July 22nd. They did not provide the clarity the family was hoping for. The independent medical examiner ruled Nolan's cause and manner of death as undetermined, pending further investigation. Around that same time, Jackson County investigators indicated that their working theory, based on the evidence available to them, was that Nolan had drowned, though they emphasized that the investigation remained open and ongoing. Mississippi State Medical Examiner conducted a separate official autopsy. That examination was completed roughly a month after Nolan's death, but as of this recording, its findings have not been made public. The district attorney overseeing the case has said explicitly that the results of that autopsy will be withheld from public view until they are formally presented to a grand jury, a decision prosecutors have defended as necessary to protect the integrity of the investigation before any evidence is released or discussed publicly. That grand jury has not yet convened. Its purpose, when it does, will be to determine whether any criminal charges are warranted in connection with Nolan Wells' death. A decision that, as of today, has not been made. Investigators have not worked in isolation. Public records indicate that roughly 60 witnesses have been interviewed as part of the effort to reconstruct Nolan's final hours on Horn Island, an unusually large number for a single-day timeline, reflecting both the crowded nature of the island that afternoon and the seriousness with which authorities say they are approaching the case. Alongside the official investigation, outside voices with relevant expertise have weighed in publicly on what the currently available evidence suggests. A former FBI agent, Jennifer Coffindaffer, reviewed what she described as the publicly available surveillance footage, witness accounts, Coast Guard communications, and information about the riptide conditions in the waters around Horn Island that day. Her assessment, offered publicly, was that when all of that information is considered together, it points toward a tragic accident rather than an intentional act. At the same time, she was careful to frame this as her own reading of the public record rather than a final determination, and she said she doubted that what is already known would turn out to be the whole truth, warning that more details could still emerge that would change that picture. Not every development in this case has stayed within the boundaries of respectful public discourse. As speculation about Nolan's death spread across social media, so did accusations, some of them aimed at specific individuals who were on Horn Island that day. One former teammate of Nolan's became the subject of online claims tying him to the case. His attorney has publicly stated that these accusations are not supported by evidence. The online speculation escalated into something more serious in late July when federal authorities announced the arrest of a man from California identified in court documents as Joseph DeMarce on charges connected to a threat made against a Mississippi judge. According to the unsealed federal complaint, DeMarce sent a bomb threat via Facebook Messenger targeting Chancery Court Judge Ashley Cole. Judge Cole is the mother of one of Nolan's friends, someone connected to the circle of young people who were on the island that day. Mississippi's Attorney General and other officials have publicly stated that they intend to take a firm stance against anyone making threats connected to this investigation, whether those threats are aimed at witnesses, families, or public officials involved in the case. It is worth pausing on that fact, not to dwell on it, but because it says something important about where this case currently stands. A young man is dead. His family does not yet have the answers they are seeking. A grand jury has not yet met. An official autopsy is complete but sealed. And in the vacuum left by all of that uncertainty, real people, a private 19-year-old woman who has never spoken publicly, a former teammate, a judge, and her family have found themselves targets of online accusation, harassment, and in at least one documented case, criminal threats. Whatever ultimately happened to Nolan Wells on Horn Island, the people around this case, on every side of it, are living through the consequences of a story that outpaced the facts available to tell it. Nolan's family has continued to speak publicly in the weeks since his death, not to offer conclusions, but to press for answers. On July 20th, a memorial service was held for Nolan at Center Point Church in Ocean Springs, Mississippi. Family and friends gathered to remember him. Photographs from his life projected on a screen behind the pulpit. Attorney Ben Crump and Reverend Al Sharpton stood alongside Nolan's parents during the service, a visible marker of just how far this case had traveled from a private family tragedy into a matter of sustained national attention. In the weeks since, Crump has continued to provide public updates on the family's independent investigation, including remarks delivered at the National Urban League's annual conference, where he described the ongoing work with oceanic engineering experts and reiterated the family's central unanswered question: what happened to their son in the hours after his friends left Horn Island without him? In the weeks since the funeral, the case has continued to move, even without a resolution in sight. The state medical examiner's office has completed its autopsy, but as before, the findings have not been released. Officials have said they will go directly into the grand jury process rather than being shared with the public first. Attorney Eric Hertz told NPR that based on the timeline of evidence his team has reviewed, he believes the case could go before a grand jury within roughly 30 days, though he was careful not to say who, if anyone, that review might ultimately concern. In the meantime, several of Nolan's friends who were on the island that day have retained their own high-profile attorneys, a sign that some of them are preparing for the possibility of wrongful death or defamation litigation once more facts become public. A separate independent analytical review, a 22-page report examining photographs, videos, GPS coordinates, and witness accounts from that day, reached a specific and consequential conclusion that a material gap still exists in the timeline, somewhere between the last independently corroborated sighting of Nolan on the island and the documented departure of the boat that had carried him there. The report is careful to state that it does not draw any conclusion about criminal or civil responsibility. What it does is name, more precisely than before, exactly where the evidence currently runs out. Attorney Ahmad Smith, another member of the family's legal team, has separately noted in correspondence with the district attorney's office that Nolan's cell phone has still not been formally examined by either the family's investigators or law enforcement, and that Dr. Roger Mitchell, the forensic pathologist who conducted the family's initial independent autopsy, has not yet had the opportunity to review additional materials gathered since that first exam. Crump's team has said that forensic audio specialists are separately reviewing the complete emergency call placed to CETO on the afternoon of July 4th, and that the oceanic engineering review of the currents around Horn Island is ongoing. Crump has continued to press the same question publicly. Given the tides in that part of the Sound, he has said, the location where Nolan's body was ultimately found simply doesn't add up. The case has also drawn attention at the federal level. The Congressional Black Caucus sent a letter to the U.S. Attorney General and the Director of the FBI calling for a federal review of the investigation, with the caucus's chair writing that the limited information coming from local investigators had left her and other members concerned. The FBI's Jackson Field office has confirmed that it has assisted the Jackson County Sheriff's Office with certain aspects of the case, providing federal tools and resources where useful, but has been clear that the Sheriff's Office remains the lead agency and will continue to lead the investigation going forward. Mississippi officials have also issued a public warning of their own in recent weeks, cautioning residents that fabricated documents purporting to be related to the Wells case have been circulating online, a reminder of just how much misinformation this case has generated in the absence of an official public answer. Christine Wansley has said, through tears, in more than one public appearance, that at the end of the day, all she and her husband want is to know what happened and why their child did not come home. It is a simple sentence, and it captures more than any piece of forensic evidence or GPS record could what is actually at stake in this case. Somewhere between the moment Nolan Wells told either Katie McCormick or his own friends what his plans were that afternoon, and the moment his body was found in the water 2 days later, something happened that no one has yet been able to fully explain. The currents around Horn Island, the argument captured on a stranger's phone, the boat that left without him, the drones that couldn't stay in the air, the jurisdictional confusion that delayed the first hours of the search, the autopsy that remains sealed, all of it circles the same unanswered question. As of this recording, Nolan Wells' case remains open. No charges have been filed. No suspect has been named. The results of the state autopsy have not been released. A grand jury has not yet convened, though attorneys involved in the case now believe that could change within a matter of weeks. What exists for now is a family still waiting, a community still divided over what they believe happened, federal lawmakers pressing for closer oversight, attorneys on multiple sides quietly preparing for the litigation that could follow whatever the grand jury eventually decides, and an investigation still working, 60 witnesses at a time, to close a material gap in the timeline that no one has yet been able to fully explain. This case will be followed closely as it develops, and any conclusions, whatever they ultimately are, deserve to be reported with the same care that Nolan Wells' family has asked the public to extend to them from the very beginning.